These correspondents were more or less remunerated. On the average, the pay given for this kind of work was 20 francs a month. Monsieur de Dampmartin, a retired major general and a member of the legislature, author of several historical and literary works, became one of the non-remunerated correspondents of the emperor by my intermediary during the years of 1813 and 1814. Another correspondent who was totally disinterested continued to write to Napoleon from 1800 to 1814. His letters, written with independence and measure, were not particularly brilliant and dealt with various acts of his government. I will not betray, as he has not done so himself, the incognito of the author of these letters, who was referendary to the audit office and who hid himself under the pseudonym Elodor. This anonymous writer published his correspondence in 1833 under the title of Letters of Elodor, addressed to Napoleon Bonaparte from March 1st, 1800 to March 17th, 1814. In speaking of the persons who addressed letters or reports to the emperor, I've made use of the word correspondent because I could not find a better expression. But as a matter of fact, Napoleon never answered these communications. I had been created Baron of the Empire in 1809 and provided with an endowment in the ancient province of Brabant. In 1811, I was appointed Maitre des Requests of the Council of State and had received an increase of endowment. I had been successively nominated Knight and then Officer of the Legion of Honor, and finally Knight of the Iron Crown. At the time when this order was created, the sovereigns who followed each other on the throne of Naples were kind enough to wish to decorate me with their orders, but although one was a brother and the other the brother-in-law of the emperor, I respectfully refused, with the emperor's approval, all the distinctions which they had been good enough to wish to confer upon me. I did violence to the feelings which made me attach great value to the proof of esteem which these sovereigns, for whom I had as much affection as respect, wished to award me. But I thought that in my capacity as secretary to the emperor, I must be absolutely independent of everybody but himself, and that, though I was not the wife of Caesar, I must be above all suspicion. The emperor, approving these scruples, thought that I could only wear the two orders of which he was the head, the decoration of the Legion of Honor and that of the Crown of Iron, with which he had deigned to honor me. When the birth of an heir seemed to have seated Napoleon's power on unshakable foundations, at a time when a free and glorious career opened itself out to his creative genius, a genius as wonderful in the works of peace as in the maneuvers of war, whilst under the shelter of a prosperity, the splendor of which shed its rays on the extremest points of the empire, he was preparing the successive able measures which were to deal a death blow to England and to assure the peace of the world, the coalition, that Hydra, with its 100 heads, which ever grew again, was not remaining inactive and was conspiring against her conqueror. She kept stirring up the ever-restless ambition of Alexander. She excited the high aristocracy of St. Petersburg against France. And, in one word, was sowing between the two allies the seeds of a misunderstanding which, though they had not yet germinated, were gradually growing in the secrecy of diplomatic negotiations. These intrigues and these underground conspiracies were soon to cause war to break out. Napoleon, faithful to the system of the alliance which had been contracted at Tilsit, was pursuing his great design of forcing England to peace. Amongst the means which it was necessary for him to use to obtain this object, some, it is true, clashed with the Russian interests. But what maritime power in Europe did not suffer by them? Napoleon could not abandon the continental system, the effects of which were beginning to be cruelly felt in England, where the distress of manufacturing classes had become extreme. The closing up of the last markets which were open to English produce, which heaped itself up in the English warehouses, reduced the working classes to misery and to revolt, and this distress reacted on the public fortune of England. Napoleon was studying the best ways of diminishing the damage caused to Russia by the execution of the blockade system. He was seeking to smooth over the difficulties and to reassure the Emperor Alexander. The emperor's marriage with Marie-Louise must have made the Tsar imagine that the policy of France had taken another turn. Napoleon's mental reservation of reestablishing the Kingdom of Poland was in Alexander's eyes a specter always full of menace. Counting for little the great advantages which he had gained at Tilsit and not hoping for any more, the Tsar had once more become accessible to the seductions of England. Alexander willfully exaggerated his reasons for discontent and rejected all Napoleon's proposals for an arrangement and all offers of compensation. Russia was secretly preparing for war, and her sovereign denied this when he was asked to explain what the arming meant. He nevertheless kept on assembling troops and accumulating stores, adopted measures which were prejudicial to French commerce, and finally let loose his bad temper on the French ambassador at St. Petersburg, the Duc de Vicence, Caulaincourt, who had long been the object of the Emperor Alexander's kindest attentions, saw coolness and repugnance succeed to confidence and the charm of the most intimate intercourse. The Duc de Vicence, accustomed to the goodwill of a prince who, affecting all the outward signs of a friendship, forgot his rank in his presence, could not support the great change which had taken place in his personal position. Persuaded that it was no longer in his power to maintain the friendly relations which till then had existed between the Russian sovereign and himself, he asked to be recalled. Napoleon agreed, giving the Emperor Alexander a proof of his respect in leaving to him the choice of the envoy to replace General Caulaincourt, who would be most agreeable to him, and mentioned the names of Messieurs de la Rochefoucauld, Narbonne, and Lauriston. Napoleon ordered the Duc de Vicence to declare once more before leaving St. Petersburg that his policy had not changed, that he persisted in the alliance, and that he offered any and every indemnity which should be really equivalent to the Duchy of Oldenburg, which he had been absolutely forced to occupy in their common interest, and with the success of his struggle against England in view. The Emperor Alexander answered these new assurances with a protest addressed to every European court against the annexation of the state of Oldenburg to the French Empire. General Lauriston, aide-de-camp of the emperor, went to take the Duc de Vicence's place in Russia. During the first audience with the Tsar accorded to the new ambassador, he checked him at the first word uttered on the subject of the arming which was going on in Russia, and proposed that a French officer should be sent off together with a Russian officer, and simultaneously with the view of assuring themselves de visu of the falseness of the reports which had been addressed to the Emperor Napoleon on this subject. And yet these armaments were only too genuine. Amongst the cause which contributed to disturb the good understanding between France and Russia, the Polish question holds the first place. Napoleon, resigned to lead the reestablishment of Poland to the future, had done his best to reassure the Emperor Alexander on this point. At his request, he had abstained from making use of the word Poland in his home and foreign communications. He had opposed the reestablishment of the Order of the White Eagle and had insisted that those who were decorated with this order should cease wearing it. He had given instruction to the French newspapers that the use of the word Poles and Poland should be avoided in writing about the Duchy of Warsaw and its inhabitants. And finally, Napoleon had authorized his ambassador in St. Petersburg to negotiate and even to conclude a convention by which France would undertake to refuse all assistance in the restoration of this ancient monarchy. This convention had been negotiated and signed by the Duc de Vicence on January 5th, 1810. It contained the following principal stipulations. 1. The Kingdom of Poland shall never be reestablished. 2. The words Pole and Poland shall never figure henceforward in any public deed. 3. Any annexation to the Duchy of Warsaw of any territory having formerly belonged to the ancient monarchy of Poland is forbidden. This convention had been immediately ratified by the Emperor Alexander and was transmitted to Paris to receive the ratification of the Emperor Napoleon. How much the imperative terms of this document and its unusual form shocked him may be imagined. Napoleon invoked the dignity of France, which was offended by the absolute and exclusive expressions used in this document. He complained of its form, of the violation of accepted customs, and of the anticipated ratifications which the Tsar had placed upon it. He declared that he could not accept the convention without examination because he had neither approved nor even known the terms in it which it was drawn up before it had been ratified by the Tsar. The Russian cabinet, in exacting no part of the territory which had belonged to the ancient Poland, should be added to the Duchy of Warsaw, refused to declare in a reciprocal manner that Poland should not be annexed to Russia. This exclusion of all reciprocity tended to make France odious to people who were attached to her by so many bonds, and even to arm them against her. At the same time, it was only in its form that Napoleon disavowed the convention. He wished, therefore, to consider the act which his representative had signed as a draft to which the future might give the necessary sanction. He was not, he said, destiny that he should declare Poland would never be reestablished. Might not that take place without his cooperation, and even in spite of himself? Who could foresee the future? Napoleon accordingly substituted for the premier project a project which was calculated to realize Russia's objects. This modified project contained an engagement on the part of France not to favor any undertaking tending to a reestablishment of the Kingdom of Poland, and rendering common to Russia, as to the Duchy of Warsaw, the interdiction of any extension of territory by districts taken from the ancient Polish provinces. The Emperor of Russia refused to listen to any modification. The only one that he proposed was that he would join with the Emperor Napoleon in undertaking to prevent any reestablishment of the Kingdom of Poland. This clinging on his part to the terms of a convention which he himself had dictated was not a proof of a friendly disposition, but rather proved a design to transform Napoleon's refusal to ratify the projected convention into one of those grievances, the pretext of which one was certain to arise in a man so jealous of the nation's honor as was the emperor. It was then one grievance, the more, that the coalition was keeping in reserve to make use of against us when the hour which it was expecting should strike. These hostile mental reservations, about which would have been difficult to become edified had the idea of them remained hidden in the minds of the princes and the ministers of the coalition, cannot be denied today. When accomplished facts have established their prearrangement, and when writers, the agents of this coalition, have even boasted of the skillful way in which they were combined, without entering into an examination of the plans of our enemies, we will content ourselves with mentioning the facts which took place before 1811, that date of which opposes itself to any admission of the statement that they were only just reprisals provoked by the French government. First of all, there is the insignificant cooperation of the Russian contingent in the 1809 campaign, when a Russian force, less in numbers than 1/5 of what had been agreed upon, acted with the French army, and then only as an observation corps, rather than as an active auxiliary. This attitude on the part of Russia showed that the St. Petersburg cabinet had not frankly broken off with the coalition, of which that year Austria was the vanguard. The confessions of Colonel Bouterlen, moreover, remove all doubts on this point. In the second place, the refusal of Princess Anna's hand, disguised under the pretext of its being necessary to obtain the consent of the Empress Mother, a consent which was not obtained after a delay of 2 months, was not any more the proof than Emperor Alexander was anxious to tighten his alliance with France. And finally, the invincible obstinacy with which this prince persisted in the unacceptable terms which he had imperiously imposed in drawing up the convention concerning Poland. And the preliminary ratification which he wrote at the bottom of this convention would be inexplicable had they not been calculated. To these signs of a growing deviation from the Tilsit alliance must be added the secret orders given by the Russian government for the execution of works of fortification on the frontier of the Grand Duchy of Warsaw, the creation of new regiments, and the extraordinary levy of 4 men out of every 500 in all the provinces of the Muscovite Empire. The movements of the troops drawn from Siberia or from the army in Finland, thanks to a secret understanding come to with Bernadotte, the recall of several army divisions from Moldavia and Wallachia, and their assembly on the frontiers of Poland at a time when, apart from the French garrisons left in the forts of Prussia, until the payment of war indemnities, France had only the corps of Marshal Davout in cantonment In the Hanseatic provinces in Germany, the immense storehouses of provisions and munitions were created at Vilna, Minsk, and other fortified places in Podolia and Volhynia. And finally, the negotiations which were entered upon at the beginning of 1811, of which I shall speak later on, between the Russian and Prussian cabinets. To these preparations, which in spite of their palpability were always denied by the Emperor Alexander, must be added to the ukase, which is said to have been issued on December 31st, 1810, so that this edict may appear to have been issued by way of reprisal on the Senatus Consultum of the 13th of the same month, which sanctioned the annexation of the Hanseatic cities to the French Empire, but the Russian decree had been long in preparation in the offices of St. Petersburg before being published. In the form of a custom house regulation, the ukase enforced not only the prohibition but even the destruction of all French goods. At the same time, English goods were allowed to enter all Russian ports, provided the ship was flying a neutral flag, a flag which English commerce never failed to use when it was in its best interest to do so. This series of hostilities put forward by Russia was completed by the formation of a corps of 90,000 armed employees under the command of superior officers of the line, a corps destined to assure the execution of the destructive measures which had been ordered against the produce of French trade. This new corps received the appellation of Guardians of the Frontier. It would indeed be difficult not to see in these acts, which we have just enumerated, a fixed determination on the part of the Russian government to renounce the continental system and once more to make common cause with England. Napoleon had been informed that since the spring of 1811, overtures had been made to Prussia to induce her to join with Russia in the attack which she was meditating on France. The dangerous situation in which Prussia would have found herself placed and the just prudence of the king kept the Prussian cabinet to its line of duty. The Emperor Alexander, better advised, renounced taking the offensive this time and postponed carrying it into effect. The hostile projects which he fostered against us, he wished to leave the apparent wrong of aggressiveness to Napoleon. A new plan of campaign was accordingly concerted, which consisted, as we saw later on, in drawing the French army into the provinces of the Russian Empire, where a desert would be made all round the invaders, who it was hoped would perish by starvation, privations of every kind, and the inclemency of an icy climate. Meanwhile, the Emperor Alexander accordingly remained on the defensive, while secretly continuing his preparations for war. Although these preparations were enshrouded in deep mystery and publicity only revealed them at the supreme moment, they could not escape Napoleon's far-seeing eye. The emperor on his side was getting ready and was sending troops quietly on to Danzig to reinforce the garrison. This brought forth autograph letters from the Tsar Alexander, who complained of the threatening attitude which France was assuming towards him. These complaints were followed by fresh arming on the part of Russia. Napoleon tried to hold Alexander on the precipitous slope down which he saw him rushing. He assured him of his desire to live in peace and implored him not to listen to perfidious inspirations, the effect of which must end in bringing about the inevitable shock between the two empires. But the Russian sovereign turned a deaf ear to these protestations, and to this advice, a feeling of distrust increased by foreign promptings had taken deep root in his mind. The importunities of every kind of English agents, obstacles which the ambitious policy of Russia encountered in the power of France, the feeling of spiteful rivalry which had resulted therefrom, invented a state of misunderstanding which, as Napoleon thought, could have been put to an end by a private conversation between the two sovereigns, if Alexander could have been brought to it.